"This quilt is garbage," my son-in-law said, loud enough for everyone at the baby shower to hear, as he lifted the blanket I had spent 3 months making and dropped it into a pile of unopened gifts like it meant nothing. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just stood there with my hands folded in front of me, the way I used to when Emily was little and I was trying to stay patient through one of her childhood tantrums. The room was decorated in soft pastel colors, pale pink balloons tied to the backs of white folding chairs, a long table covered in finger foods, and a 3-tier cake that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. Laughter filled the air, but it shifted just slightly after his words landed. Not silence, not quite, but something thinner, fragile. I looked at my daughter. Emily didn't look at me. She adjusted the ribbon on one of the gift bags and gave a small, polite smile to someone across the room, as if nothing had happened. As if I hadn't just watched a piece of my heart get dismissed in front of 20 people. I had chosen every piece of fabric in that quilt carefully. There was a square from the blue dress Emily wore on her first day of kindergarten, a strip from the old curtains that hung in her childhood bedroom, even a small corner from the shirt her father used to wear on Sunday mornings before he passed. I stitched those memories together late at night, under a warm lamp, when the house was quiet and the past felt close enough to touch. I imagined her wrapping her baby in it, telling stories about where each piece came from. I imagined it lasting longer than I would. Jason laughed softly, brushing his hands together like he had just gotten rid of dust. "We're going for a more modern look in the nursery," he added, glancing around as if expecting agreement. A few people chuckled. Someone nodded. I felt my fingers tighten slightly, so I loosened them again. Slow. Controlled. I had learned a long time ago that not every moment deserved a reaction. Some moments deserved to be remembered. Carefully. Completely. I picked up my purse from the chair beside me. The leather felt cool and steady in my grip. Emily still hadn't looked at me. Not once. And in that quiet space between his words and her silence, I understood something I hadn't wanted to see before. I gave a small smile. Not for them. For myself. Then I turned and walked toward the door, already knowing that what I did next would not happen in this room. I drove home with both hands steady on the wheel, even though I could feel something inside me shifting with every mile. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the road, and for a moment it reminded me of the years when I used to pick Emily up from school, her small hand gripping mine as she told me about her day. I pulled into my driveway and sat there for a while before turning off the engine, listening to the quiet. My house had not changed. The porch light was still the same warm yellow. The wind chimes near the door still made that soft, familiar sound. But something felt different, like a space had opened that I could not close again. I stepped inside and set my purse down on the kitchen counter, the same counter where I had once helped Emily with homework, where we had baked cookies on Sunday afternoons. I did not turn on the television. I did not reach for my phone. Instead, I walked slowly to the small room at the back of the house, the one I had turned into my sewing space after my husband passed. The quilt scraps were still laid out on the table, pieces of fabric I had not used yet, colors that once held meaning I had been so certain would be understood. I ran my fingers over them, one by one, feeling the texture, the threads, the careful stitches that had taken hours to complete. I remembered the night I finished it, how I folded it gently, how I placed it in a box lined with tissue paper, how I smiled to myself thinking about the moment I would hand it to her. I had believed that moment would be warm. I had believed it would matter. I pulled out a chair and sat down, folding my hands in my lap again, just like I had at the party. There was no anger in me, not in the way people expect. It was something quieter than that. Clearer, like finally seeing a picture come into focus after years of looking at it through fog. I stood up after a few minutes and opened the drawer where I kept important documents, the ones I had not needed to look at in a long time. Insurance papers, bank statements, a folder with my will. I placed it on the table and looked at it without opening it, just letting the weight of it settle into my thoughts. Then I reached for my phone, scrolled through my contacts, and paused on a name I had not called in years. I did not hesitate. I pressed dial and lifted the phone to my ear, my voice calm when I finally spoke. "Hello, this is Margaret Whitmore. I would like to schedule a meeting." I arrived at the attorney's office the next morning 10 minutes early, the same way I used to arrive at every parent-teacher conference when Emily was growing up, prepared and composed, even when I knew I might hear something I did not want to hear. The building was quiet. all glass and polished floors, the kind of place where everything felt deliberate and controlled. I sat in the waiting area with my purse resting neatly on my lap, watching the receptionist type without looking up, the steady rhythm of her keyboard filling the silence. I did not feel nervous. That surprised me more than anything. For years, I had avoided making changes, avoided difficult decisions, telling myself that family would always find its way back to something soft and familiar. But sitting there, I realized that I had been the one holding that softness in place, stitching it together the same way I had stitched that quilt, piece by piece, hoping it would last. A man in a navy suit stepped out of an office and called my name. His voice was calm, professional. I followed him down a hallway lined with framed certificates and muted artwork, noticing how everything here seemed permanent, documented, undeniable. When we sat across from each other, he asked a simple question. "What can I help you with today, Mrs. Whitmore?" I placed my folder on the desk and opened it carefully, smoothing the edges of the papers even though they were already straight. "I would like to review and update my will," I said. My voice did not waver. He nodded, asking, "About my current assets, my property, my accounts, all the things I had built over a lifetime of careful choices and quiet sacrifices." As he spoke, I thought about the house I was sitting in, the one I had paid off years ago, the savings I had set aside not just for myself, but for the future I believed I was securing for my daughter and her family. I answered each question clearly, without hesitation. Then he paused and looked at me more closely. "Are there specific changes you have in mind?" I held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once. "Yes," I said. "I would like to remove my daughter as the primary beneficiary." The words settled into the room without echo, firm and complete. He did not react with surprise, only a small, understanding nod as he made a note. We discussed alternatives, options that would ensure my assets were protected, structured, directed with intention rather than assumption. I listened carefully, asking questions where I needed clarity, making decisions the same way I always had, thoughtfully, without rushing. When the meeting ended, I signed the preliminary documents and stood up, smoothing my coat before stepping back into the hallway. The world outside the office looked the same as it had the day before, but I knew something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. For the first time in a long while, I was no longer waiting to be seen. I was deciding what would remain when I was gone. I returned home that afternoon and placed my keys in the small ceramic dish by the door, the one Emily had made for me in elementary school with uneven edges and fingerprints pressed into the clay. I stood there for a moment, looking at it, remembering how proud she had been when she handed it to me, her eyes bright, waiting for my reaction. I had kept it all these years without thinking twice. Some things you hold on to because they carry meaning, even when time changes everything else. I walked into the living room and sat down on the couch, my hands resting calmly in my lap. And for the first time since the baby shower, I allowed myself to look back, not at the moment itself, but at everything that had led up to it. It had not started with that day. It never does. I thought about the first time Jason corrected me in my own kitchen, his tone polite but firm, telling me that people did things differently now, that traditions were not as important as I seemed to believe. Emily had laughed lightly, brushing it off, but she did not defend me. I told myself it was nothing, just a difference in generations. Then there were the holidays that slowly changed without discussion. Thanksgiving moved to their house. Then Christmas morning became inconvenient for them. And eventually, I found myself being invited as a guest instead of included as family. Each change was small, reasonable even, easy to accept on its own. I remembered the phone calls that became shorter, the visits that were postponed, the way Emily started to check with Jason before agreeing to anything, as if my presence required approval. I had noticed all of it. I had simply chosen not to name it. I stood up and walked to the hallway where a row of framed photographs lined the wall. Emily at 5 years old, missing her front tooth and holding a stuffed bear. Emily at 16, standing in her graduation gown. Emily on her wedding day, smiling in a way that looked certain, hopeful. I reached out and adjusted one of the frames, even though it was already straight. That was when I understood the pattern clearly, not as separate moments, but as a single, steady shift that had been happening for years. I had been stepping back, inch by inch, making space for her new life, believing that there would always be a place for me within it. But space, once given, does not always return. I lowered my hand and stepped back, taking in the full line of photographs, the story they told, the one I had helped build. There was no bitterness in me, only clarity, the kind that arrives quietly, without announcement, and once it is there, it does not leave. I turned off the hallway light and walked back into the living room, already knowing that the next time I saw my daughter, I would not be the same woman who had stood in that decorated room and said nothing. This time, my silence would not be waiting. It would be a decision. 2 days passed before Emily called me, and even then, her voice carried a careful lightness, the kind people use when they are testing the temperature of a room they are not sure they belong in anymore. I let the phone ring twice before answering, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted to hear the silence between each ring, to remind myself that I no longer needed to rush toward her voice the way I once did. "Hello," I said, my tone steady, the same tone I had used in the attorney's office, the same tone I was beginning to recognize as something new. There was a brief pause on the other end. Then she spoke, asking how I was, as if the question itself could smooth over what had already settled between us. I told her I was fine. I did not ask how she was in return. That seemed to surprise her. She filled the space quickly, mentioning the baby shower, saying that things had been hectic, that Jason had been stressed, that everyone had been trying to make the day perfect. Her words moved carefully around the truth, never touching it directly. I listened without interrupting, letting her finish each sentence, letting the weight of what she was not saying sit between us. At one point, she laughed softly, a small, uncertain sound, and said that I should not take things so personally, that the quilt had simply not matched the theme they had chosen for the nursery. I closed my eyes for a moment, not in pain, but in recognition. There it was. Not an apology, not even an acknowledgment, just a quiet rewriting of the moment into something smaller, something easier to dismiss. I opened my eyes again and looked out the window at the backyard, where the wind moved gently through the trees, the same trees that had stood there through every season of my life in this house. "I understand," I said, and I did. Not the explanation she was offering, but the truth behind it. She let out a breath, as if relieved, and quickly shifted the conversation, asking if I would like to come by next week to see the nursery once it was finished. I pictured the room she described, modern and carefully arranged, free of anything that carried the weight of the past. I thought about the quilt, folded somewhere out of sight, or perhaps already forgotten entirely. That is when I realized that the invitation was not about me being included. It was about confirming that I would continue to accept my place at the edge of their lives. I held the phone a little closer and spoke clearly, without hesitation. "I do not think that will be necessary." There was another pause, longer this time, heavier. Emily said my name softly, as if she was hearing something unfamiliar in my voice. I did not explain. I did not fill the silence for her. I simply waited, knowing that for the first time, she would have to decide what to say next without me guiding the moment. After I ended the call, I did not set the phone down right away. I held it in my hand for a moment longer, listening to the quiet that followed, a different kind of silence than before, one that did not feel empty but settled. I placed it gently on the table and walked back into my sewing room, the late afternoon light casting a soft glow across the fabric still spread out from days earlier. I did not sit this time. Instead, I began to move with purpose, gathering the remaining pieces, folding them carefully, stacking them into neat piles. There was no hesitation in my movements, no second guessing. Each fold felt like a decision being made, one after another, small but certain. I opened the closet and took down the storage box where I kept finished work, placing the unused fabric inside, closing the lid with a quiet finality. Then I reached for the quilt I had made, the one I had brought back home after the baby shower without anyone noticing. I had picked it up before I left, before anyone could decide its place for me. I unfolded it slowly across the table, letting the full pattern reveal itself again. It was still beautiful. The stitches were even, the colors warm, the memories intact. Nothing about it had changed except the way it had been received. I ran my hand over the surface once, then twice, feeling the weight of it, not as rejection, but as something that still belonged to me. I folded it again, more deliberately this time, and carried it to the hallway closet where I kept things that mattered but did not need to be displayed. I placed it on the top shelf, within reach, but out of sight. That felt right. I stepped back and closed the door, then stood there for a moment, noticing how calm everything felt. Not quiet in a lonely way, but steady, clear. I returned to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, taking a slow sip as I looked out the window again. The trees moved the same way they always had, the world outside unchanged, but inside, something had settled into place. I no longer felt the need to wait for another call, another explanation, another invitation that asked me to stand just outside the center of their lives. That space no longer belonged to me, and I was no longer trying to step back into it. Instead, I walked to the small desk by the window and opened a drawer, taking out a notebook I had not used in years. I sat down and opened it to the first blank page, picking up a pen and holding it still for a moment before writing a single line across the top. I am done waiting. The words looked simple on the page, but they carried a weight I had not allowed myself to feel until now. I closed the notebook and set it aside, not as a declaration to anyone else, but as something I understood fully for myself. Then I stood up, turned off the light, and let the evening settle in without interruption. 3 days later, a small package arrived at my front door just after noon, left neatly beside the welcome mat, as if it carried no weight at all. I opened the door, looked down at it, and immediately recognized the wrapping paper. Pale pink, with tiny gold stars. The same pattern from the baby shower. I did not bend down right away. I stood there for a moment, letting the sight settle in, letting the intention behind it reveal itself without rushing to meet it. Then I picked it up, feeling how light it was, and carried it inside, placing it on the kitchen counter where the sunlight touched the surface just enough to make the paper shimmer. I did not open it immediately. Instead, I washed my hands, dried them carefully, and only then returned to the package, sliding one finger beneath the tape and lifting it slowly so it would not tear. Inside, folded without care, was the quilt. No note, no explanation, just the quilt, returned like something misplaced, something no longer needed. I looked at it for a long moment before touching it, noticing how the edges had been creased differently than I had folded them, how one corner was slightly wrinkled. It was not damaged, not ruined, just handled without thought. I lifted it gently and unfolded it across the counter, smoothing the fabric with both hands, pressing out the lines that did not belong. My fingers paused over the small square from her childhood dress, the one I had stitched with extra care. I remembered the way she had twirled in that dress, laughing, asking me if it looked pretty. I had told her it was perfect. I stood there in the quiet kitchen, the quilt laid out in front of me, and realized that this was not an apology. It was a return, a quiet admission that it did not belong in their world. I folded it again, slowly, deliberately, restoring each edge to the way I had made it, not the way it had come back to me. Then I carried it back to the closet, placed it on the same top shelf, and closed the door with the same steady motion as before. When I turned back toward the kitchen, my phone lit up on the counter. A message from Emily. Just a few words. Thought you might want it back. I read it once, then set the phone face down without replying. There was nothing left to clarify, no misunderstanding to correct. The line between us had already been drawn, not in anger, but in action. And now, it had been confirmed in the simplest way possible. I walked to the window and looked out at the yard, the same trees, the same light, the same quiet that had begun to feel like something I could trust. I did not feel hurt in the way I once would have. I felt certain. And that certainty was stronger than anything she could have said. The following week moved quietly, each day unfolding without interruption, and I let it. I kept my routines the same, waking early, making coffee, sitting by the window as the morning light settled across the floor. There was a steadiness in that rhythm that I had not noticed before, or perhaps had not allowed myself to appreciate. On Thursday morning, I returned to the attorney's office to finalize the documents we had discussed. This time, I did not arrive early. I arrived exactly on time. The receptionist greeted me with a small, polite smile, and I returned it with the same calm ease I had begun to carry with me everywhere. When I sat down across from the attorney again, the folder was already prepared, each page marked with small tabs indicating where my signature was needed. He reviewed the changes with me once more, clear and direct, making sure I understood every detail. I listened carefully, asking a few final questions, not out of doubt, but out of intention. When he turned the documents toward me and handed me the pen, I did not hesitate. I signed each page with a steady hand, my name written the same way it had always been, but carrying a different meaning now. When I finished, He gathered the papers, placed them neatly back into the folder, and assured me that everything would be filed and secured properly. I thanked him, stood up, and walked out of the office without looking back. Outside, the air was cool, a light breeze moving through the trees along the sidewalk. I paused for a moment before getting into my car, not because I was uncertain, but because I recognized the moment for what it was. A quiet ending. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just complete. When I returned home, I placed the copy of the documents in the same drawer where I had first taken them out, but this time, I did not leave them at the bottom. I set them on top, within easy reach, as if acknowledging their presence instead of hiding it away. The house felt the same, but I moved through it differently now, without that subtle pull toward the phone, without the quiet expectation of a call that might or might not come. That evening, as the light faded and the rooms softened into shadow, I sat in the living room and allowed the silence to settle around me fully. It was no longer something I filled. It was something I chose. And in that choice, I found a kind of peace that did not depend on anyone else. It was Sunday when the next invitation came, not through a message this time, but through a call, her name appearing on my phone screen in the early afternoon while I was standing at the kitchen sink, drying a plate I had just washed. I looked at it for a moment before answering, not with hesitation, but with awareness, as if I already understood the shape of the conversation before it began. Her voice sounded softer this time, more careful, as if she had practiced what she was about to say. She told me they were having a small gathering the following weekend, just close friends and a few family members, to celebrate the final touches on the nursery before the baby arrived. She said it would mean a lot if I came. I did not respond immediately. I set the plate down, placed the towel neatly beside the sink, and walked slowly to the window, looking out at the yard where the light moved gently across the grass. I asked her what time. She told me. I said I would be there. The call ended shortly after, with no mention of what had happened before, no attempt to revisit it. Only a quiet agreement that I would step back into their space again. The day of the gathering arrived with the same calm rhythm as the days before it. I dressed simply, choosing a light blue blouse and a pair of slacks, nothing that called attention, nothing that asked for approval. When I arrived at their house, the front door was already open, voices drifting out into the driveway along with the soft sound of music. I stepped inside and was greeted with polite smiles, casual greetings, the kind that acknowledge presence without inviting closeness. The house looked exactly as I imagined it would. Clean lines, neutral colors, everything carefully arranged to reflect a certain kind of modern comfort. I moved through the space quietly, observing, not searching for anything, just noticing. Then I saw the nursery. The door was open, and from where I stood, I could see the soft gray walls, the white crib, the neatly arranged shelves filled with items that looked untouched, chosen more for appearance than memory. I stepped closer, just enough to take it in fully. There was no trace of anything I had made. No trace of anything that came from before. I stood there for a moment, my hands resting calmly at my sides, and then I turned away, not because I felt unwelcome, but because I understood that I was no longer looking for a place within that room. As I walked back into the living area, I saw Emily watching me from across the room, her expression unreadable, waiting perhaps for a reaction, a comment, something she could respond to. I met her gaze briefly, then looked away, not out of avoidance, but out of completion. There was nothing left to say in that moment. Not here. Not like this. And as the conversations around me continued, I realized that I was not standing in the same place I had stood before. This time, I was not the one being measured. I was the one who had already decided. The conversations around me carried on with an easy rhythm, glasses clinking softly, light laughter rising and falling as if nothing in the room had ever shifted. I moved through it without resistance, accepting a glass of water when someone offered, nodding politely when spoken to, my presence acknowledged but not examined. It was not uncomfortable. It was simply clear. After a while, Emily approached me, her steps measured, her smile carefully placed. She stood beside me, close enough that others might assume we were speaking quietly, privately, like mother and daughter should. I turned slightly to face her, waiting. She asked if I had seen the nursery. I told her I had. She searched my face for something, perhaps approval, perhaps relief, but I gave her neither. Instead, I asked her if she was happy with it. She nodded quickly, almost too quickly, and said it was exactly what she had wanted. I believed her. That was what made the moment settle so completely. Jason joined us then, his presence filling the space with the same casual confidence I had seen before. He greeted me with a brief nod, nothing more, then began speaking about the house, the renovations, the plans they had moving forward. I listened without interrupting, the details passing through me without leaving a mark. At one point, he mentioned how important it was to build a future that reflected their own choices, not outdated expectations. The words were not directed at me, but they did not need to be. I understood their purpose. I met his gaze for a brief moment, then looked away, not in dismissal, but in acknowledgment. He had said what he needed to say, and I had already decided what it meant. Emily shifted slightly beside him, her posture tightening in a way that suggested she was aware of something unspoken, something she could not quite name. She opened her mouth as if to add something, then closed it again, her eyes flickering between us. I did not step in to ease the moment. I let it stand as it was. After a few minutes, I placed my glass on the nearest table and reached for my purse. I did not announce my departure. I simply turned toward the door and walked at the same steady pace I had carried with me all week. As I stepped outside, the air felt cooler, quieter, untouched by the noise inside. I paused at the edge of the walkway, not to look back, but to feel the finality of the moment settle into place. I had come, I had seen, and I had understood. There was nothing left to confirm. I walked to my car, opened the door, and sat down, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. For a moment, I allowed myself to sit in the silence, the kind that no longer asked anything from me. Then I started the engine and drove away, not as someone leaving, but as someone who had already arrived where she needed to be. The next morning began like the others, quiet and steady, the sunlight stretching across the kitchen floor as I poured my coffee and stood by the window. There was no sense of aftermath, no lingering tension from the day before, only a clarity that had settled into place and refused to leave. I carried my cup to the small desk by the window and sat down, opening the drawer where I kept my documents. The folder was exactly where I had placed it, the edges neat, the weight of it familiar now. I opened it slowly, not because I needed to read it again, but because I wanted to feel the certainty of what had already been decided. Every page was in order, every signature exactly where it needed to be. Nothing left unfinished. Nothing left to question. I closed the folder and returned it to the drawer, leaving it at the top where it belonged. The phone remained silent throughout the morning, and I noticed that I did not check it once. That, more than anything, told me how much had changed. By midday, I stepped outside to tend to the small garden along the side of the house, pulling a few weeds, adjusting the soil, letting my hands move through something simple and real. The air was mild, the kind that carried a quiet promise of change without needing to announce it. As I worked, I found myself thinking not about what had been said or done, but about what would not happen anymore. There would be no more waiting for invitations that placed me on the edge. No more accepting explanations that asked me to ignore what I could already see. No more adjusting myself to fit into spaces that no longer held me. The realization did not feel heavy. It felt clean. When I finished, I brushed the dirt from my hands and stood up, looking at the small row of plants now sitting evenly in the soil. It was not a grand transformation, just a quiet correction, but it was enough. Later that afternoon, I heard the soft sound of a notification from my phone resting on the kitchen counter. I walked inside, dried my hands, and glanced at the screen. A message from Emily. Just one line. "Are you upset with me?" I read it once, then again, not searching for meaning, but recognizing the absence of something more important. There was still no acknowledgment, no understanding, only a question that placed the weight back onto me. I set the phone down without typing a response. I did not feel the need to explain myself, not anymore. Some things do not require words once they have been fully understood. I turned away from the counter and walked back toward the living room, the quiet of the house settling around me once again, not as something to fill, but as something I had chosen. And in that choice, there was no space left for doubt. The message stayed unanswered through the rest of the day, and into the next, not because I was trying to make a point, but because I no longer felt the need to respond to something that did not ask the right question. On the third morning, I woke before the sun had fully risen and found myself standing in the hallway, without quite remembering how I had gotten there. My eyes rested on the closet door, the one that held the quilt on its top shelf. For a moment, I simply stood there, listening to the quiet of the house, the kind of quiet that had once felt too large but now felt exactly the right size. I opened the door and reached up, bringing the quilt down carefully, holding it the same way I had the night I finished it. I carried it into the living room and spread it across the back of the couch, smoothing it gently, letting the colors catch the early light. It did not look out of place here. It never had. I sat down across from it and took it in fully, every stitch, every piece of fabric, every memory I had woven into it without expecting anything in return. That was when I understood something I had not allowed myself to see before. The quilt had never been about being accepted. It had never been about fitting into someone else's idea of what mattered. It had been about what I chose to give, freely, without condition. And that had not changed, even if the way it was received had. I stood up and walked to the hallway, lifting each photograph from the wall one by one, not to remove them, but to clean the glass, to straighten the frames, to see them clearly again without the weight I had been carrying. Emily was still there in every stage of her life, still part of the story I had lived and built. That did not disappear simply because something had shifted, but neither did it require me to stay where I was no longer valued. I returned to the living room and sat down again, the quilt resting quietly behind me, not hidden, not displayed for anyone else, just present. My phone remained on the table, still and silent. I did not reach for it. I did not wait for it. Outside, the light grew stronger, filling the room in a way that felt steady and certain. I placed my hands in my lap and let the moment settle fully, without needing to change it. I had given what I could. I had seen what I needed to see. And in the end, I did not need to take anything back. I simply chose what to carry forward. Silence was no longer something I endured. It was something I owned. And for the first time in a very long time, it felt like enough.